Or what are the trade-offs? And that's what personal finance really is. You can spend $1 once, you can save it, set aside and spend it on something else or give it away in the future. Make it a good decision. Make sure that you're all on the same page, and then recognize that expectations are the piece that leads into that, right? So what are your expectations going into that, and helping your kids set it?
Welcome to the Military Money Manual Podcast, where every episode is all about achieving financial independence in the military faster than before. We believe personal finance shouldn't be boring or intimidating. Building wealth can be simple, and financial freedom is the ultimate financial goal. Now, here's your hosts, Spencer and Jamie.
One of the most frequent questions that we get from our listeners and from our readers, Daniel, is about their kids and about how they can set up their kids for success, not just with money, but in life in general. It's a pretty broad question. And today in the podcast, we wanted to get you back on here. We had a great first podcast episode with you where we talked about money scripts and understanding the different psychological mindset shifts and mind states that people have when they're talking about money or when they're not talking about money, right? Like avoiding money discussions is one of the most common things that you'll see with clients and with families. But we wanted to bring you on the show today, Daniel, to tap your experience and understand how can we set up our military kids for success with money.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invite. I'm glad to be back here. And first, the caveat, I don't profess to be a parenting expert in anything we're going to talk about. But one of the advantages of sitting in this role is getting to see into the lives of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of family scenarios. Some good, some challenging, some very, very successful, quote unquote, financially, and some maybe less so along the spectrum, and getting to see a lot of that. So I'll translate that gleaned experience along with some of the academic research and things like that I've come across to be a help to your listeners.
When we're starting out early on, a lot of times new parents have a lot of questions. We get parenting classes on how to change diapers, how to swaddle. I know you're still in kind of a newborn phase right now with kid number 2. But no one talks about how to raise, well, to steal from the book title, that's probably going to come up in the answer, to raise money-savvy kids. What are some initial thoughts of just how can we start in the early years with parenting wisely, talking about money?
Yeah, so I mean, Spencer kind of alluded to this in a prior conversation, right? Getting things set in your own headspace, and certainly if you have a spouse or a partner, right, making sure that you two are getting on the same page, because money is sort of like the fish example of swimming through the water. Like, what's water, right? It just exists all around us. And kids, especially in the early years, they're not going to be able to pick up on things. Now, they might literally pick up money. Don't put it in your mouth, right? That might be an early lesson. But, right, they're going to pick up on the lessons around money. I often tell people this is all about lessons that are caught, not taught. You know, you don't necessarily explicitly teach things, but like tension. Is money a source of tension? Kids very young are going to pick up on that, right? Is money a source of stress or pride? Like, what are the experiences that you had as a kid growing up in your family of origin? Now you've translated that out. Maybe you're trying to swing the pendulum back the other way, but recognize that there's so much there that's below the surface. Kids are going to pick up on that long before we start actually getting into the age when they can actually do math or dollars and cents and teach them about spending, saving, getting, which we'll get into. So just recognizing that the home environment in which you said it and the source of stress, like, work on that. That's one of the biggest things about teaching your kids and translating into a good, healthy mindset and approach to money.
When people go to an advisor or go to a therapist and they ask, how can I make sure that I'm teaching the right money lessons to my kids so they don't get screwed up, so that they're successful in the future? But what it forces you to do is get your own money situation. Like you were saying, if money is a source of stress, if you are in a high debt situation where a lot of your monthly income is going towards debt repayments and things are tight, right? Like maybe you're not saving as much, maybe you're not saving anything, maybe you're literally living paycheck to paycheck. Or we had a advisor on the show recently who was talking about a client that was going backwards. They had sold a house and their spending, they were basically just drawing down on the savings that they had accumulated from selling that house. And within a couple months or years, they would be approaching a zero or a negative net worth if they didn't slow down their spending because they had become accustomed to a certain way of life. I guess it's a great question, and it does force the parents or the parent or the adult in the family to start addressing their own money scripts, their own money stories, and figuring out, I need to make sure that I've got this figured out so that when my kids are observing me, that they can start to catch the lessons that, oh, money is not a shameful topic. Money is something that two adults discuss, and they discuss calmly. And maybe sometimes there's emotions, but it's not something that's always done behind closed doors. Sometimes you can even have family money meetings at a dining room table. That could be something that you do, every time the kids get allowance, or it could be something that you do once a month. And I like the idea of the annual money conference where you get the whole family together, and maybe you have a vote on, okay, what charities are we going to support this year? Maybe you look at the spending for last year and you just ask the kids and you say, does this align with your values, right? Like if you were setting the budget, which they're not, but they can have input into it, but do you think we should be spending this much on going out to eat? And maybe they think, yeah, we should be spending more on that. And you, okay, then that's great. That's your value, but maybe that's not the parent's value. But that might be for a family with much older kids. This can start very young, right? Like you can start with kids as young as 7. I think a lot of money beliefs are kind of solidified even at a very young age.
Yeah, a lot of academic research indicates that most money personalities is set in that age 5, 6, 7, something like that, long before they'd even actually be able to describe, just because it's just, again, that culture that they're growing up in. So there's just so much there that goes into that's hard to step at. And one of the reasons why I love when I'm working with clients to step back and ask a question like, tell me about some of your first memories of money. What was that like? Was money a source of stress? What was it like when you got your first job? How did you have financial sources of anxiety? Or was it something that didn't even cross your mind until later on, right? So understanding that kind of gets you the beginning of it. But yeah, earlier conversations about what's important and then starting to delay gratification. Now, you don't have to have money to know if your kid is a delayed gratification kid, right? Or tendency towards that, right? Because kids who can delay gratification towards other things are probably going to have a greater tendency towards that with money, right? And so if you know your kid has that tendency, okay, then maybe they need a little bit more nudges on spending that, right? Using it and spending it wisely. I tended to be a very strong tightwad when I was a kid growing up. In fact, I think I lent out money to my siblings at usurious rates of interest. So I ran the Bank of Daniel at one point. I don't know if my mom ever knew about that, but anyway. Meanwhile, some of my siblings were more the spendthrift, right? And so they needed a little bit more nudges perhaps on the other side of like learning how to save. So I start with know your kid, like what is their tendencies, and go from there.
It's interesting that the initial answer there wasn't do this, then this. The first step is conversation, awareness, and alignment between parents, if applicable, and realizing the impact of statements such as like, we can't afford that. And a young kid hearing that in that way puts a money script in their mind that they might not ever realize until they have a therapist or a financial coach or someone like they hear this podcast 30 years in the future, where they realize that, oh, that did something to me before I even knew that was a thing. And now I have this mindset with money based on what I heard around my house.
That's a really good example. And that may actually be true, right? You actually may have looked at your finances appropriately and determined this is not something we can afford. But really, fundamentally, that's also a choice. And this is all about helping kids learn early choices. One of the best pieces of advice that I've seen and used and walk clients through and seen other clients do even before we ever work together is the idea of, certainly when kids are young, teaching them kind of the 3 buckets. So you've got spending bucket, you've got saving bucket, and you've got giving. Now, what percentage you allocate into that and how you do it, but like starting maybe with a glass jar or a glass piggy bank or something like that, a clear piggy bank that allows them to see physical money accumulating in there and start to go from there. And then maybe teaching them at an appropriate age about making deposits into like a financial institution or banking, and then letting them start to manage. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of how I was taught to teach students back in the training squadron, which is, okay, teach an academic lesson, sit down, demo perfect for the student, get up, sit the student down. They get to practice doing it with input, supervision, correction all along the way. And then I gradually step back until I hand them off to the evaluator. Give them the check ride. All right, they get watched, but not figured out. And there's kind of a similar philosophy, I feel like, here with kids and money. Like, start with small lessons, give them chances to practice, give them chances to fail, especially as they get a little bit older and things like that. Like, maybe it was not the wisest decision for them to blow all their spending budget on thing XYZ. Maybe that would be a powerful lesson for them to learn how to do that, though, in fact.
Yeah, it's all about making mistakes when the stakes aren't very high. And it's actually, so I was talking to some college students the other day, and they were saying, what do you think about investing while you're in university? And I said, yeah, it's a great idea. And I said, in fact, what you might want to do is try day trading and try options trading and try a bunch of things that I normally wouldn't recommend anybody try. But if you're gambling with $1,000 and you lose $1,000, you're going to learn a powerful lesson that, oh, this doesn't work. And if you have that pull towards the more active investing strategies, let's call them, yeah, try those. Absolutely. I said, actually, the worst thing that can probably happen is you're good at it and then keep going down that road until the stakes get very high. And I encourage them to, I was like, yeah, try some stuff and see what works. And because I think it's one of those things where if you have the experience, I never learned my lesson because I'm always like, oh, what about this stock, with my little 1% of my play money. And then like Rocket Lab was my most recent one. I held that for 2 years, sold it. And then of course, in the last couple of months, it rockets off to the moon. Once again, proving that I'm very good at picking stocks. I'm not very good at holding them long enough to actually pay off. One of the things you said there, Daniel, was letting the kids make their own choices and make their own mistakes. And I think one of the other lessons, and you talked about the 3 buckets of giving, saving, and spending. But I think another great concept that I picked up when I was a child was wants versus needs. Teaching a child that like there are some things that you want and there's some things that you need. And you could pull out Maslow's hierarchy of needs if you want to and kind of show like, okay, like at the base here, I as the parent am covering these things for you. But if I wasn't here or when you're older, these are the things that you're going to need to make sure are taken care of. Now, modern society, we have clean tap water. We have houses that have insulation. We have a lot of those things are just kind of, we've set up systems. So those things are kind of automated and taken care of. But I think it's good to kind of show the children. And, this is actually another good thing about taking kids out into the outdoors and camping and hiking is because you gotta go back to those Maslow hierarchy of needs. And it's like, okay, once we've gotten our needs taken care of, then we can think about our wants. And a lot of time kids are only thinking about their wants, right? They're only thinking about the Minecraft toy or the candy that they want to go buy. And they're not thinking about others for one, but they're also not thinking about like making sure that they have allocated resources to take care of their needs before they're taking care of their wants.
Yeah, especially when you think about like finding ways to have those open, transparent conversations within the family at the appropriate age and stage of life is not making this money thing a big secret, right? Because Ron Lieber, one of the books I'm recommending here is, called The Opposite of Spoiled. And in that book, he wrote about like the idea of spoiled kids aren't just spoiled with money. They're kids who don't understand the effort that it took to get what they have. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've seen more regularly, especially I'm going to blame Instagram for this, is the idea of comparison is the thief of joy, right? And so we got a lot of young people, especially who've grown up in a world in which mom and dad, successful, saved up a lot, they get launched into their life. And it's hard, right? Initially, especially early on, starting out, early salaries, things like that. Not only do they get to compare them to their parents' standard of living they got, maybe especially after they'd been working very hard for many decades, now they get to compare themselves to everybody on Instagram, including rich kids, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, right? And so now you have this terrible tendency, which is, what I have is not good enough, because it's also disconnected from all the things that we can't see. Because money, remember, we just talked about at the very beginning, is not actually about the dollars and cents. It's the hopes, the fears, the dreams that we attach to them and how it exists all around us. Nobody has, it reminds me of an old television commercial years ago, showed like people walking around with big net worth numbers over their heads floating. It's like, what's your number, right? We don't know that. Like we see people with the flashy stuff and they might be very in debt and have a negative net worth, but of course we can't always see that. So teaching kids early on that effort is attached to the money. So there was time, there was energy that went into that, right? Decades of hard work that often mom and dad, you were the ones putting in. So again, being transparent, having age-appropriate conversation about what it took to get where you are today, And then also recognizing that just because little Johnny or so-and-so over there has this, much less the social media world in which we live, oh man, like peel back the onion, help reveal the facade of the world in which we live. And so we don't look at it with these awful rose-colored glasses that change everything about how we see it.
I think there's so much debate, even from Instagram, like parenting channels of, you have to pay your kids for chores, teach them that work equals the reward of money. And then other experts are saying, no, they get allowance just for being part of the family, and they do some work around the house just because they're part of the family. And I think what I would encourage people to talk about is that it doesn't matter which way you go, in my opinion, as long as you're having those positive money conversations, you and your spouse, if applicable, are coming up with that philosophy together of what you want to portray to the kids, and that you're not just doing it. One of the things I struggle with as a young parent, you're not just doing it because you're trying to overcompensate for what your parents did or did not provide for you. And so I always wanted like a little Tykes Power Wheels car, never got one. So guess what my kid got? As soon as he was 5 years old, he got a Power Wheels car. And is that $200 or $300 decision? Is that life-changing for me or for him? No, it's not. But it could be a dangerous road if you don't recognize what the intentions are behind that. And that is early years, especially in the middle years as teens and preteens start to have more peer pressure considerations.
I really like that example there, because you want to give the kids often what you didn't have. But if you give the kids what you didn't have, then their path has been altered. What's that old saying, from like shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations? I'm reading another book right now by Victor Hagani and James White called The Missing Billionaires. And it is one of the most fascinating books I have read, talking about outsized or incorrectly sized pricing decisions. So one of the things they looked at, and risk associated with that, they looked at the original millionaires from like 100 years ago in our country, and they figured out that with appropriate stock market returns and things like that, that there should be more than 1,000 billionaires from the descendants of those families, and there's not there. So somewhere along the way, we've just gotten used to, throughout history, not always managing finances well that get passed down. So regardless, we're going to talk about tactics, about dollars and cents and UTMAs and 529s here in just a minute. But as long as you get the philosophy right about the lessons that you pass on, reminds me of the old Benjamin Franklin quote, right? An investment in knowledge earns the best interest, or something to that effect, right? Mm-hmm. Teaching your kids some of these valuable life lessons about what's important and how to make decisions wisely is the thing that's going to pay dividends through generations to come.
Yeah, there's a quote on Reddit, Fatfire, maybe it was in Long Angle, and I think it was on Fatfire, and something to the effect of, money is the least valuable thing I can give my kids. And it was about how it's really the values and the lessons and the experience that you can pass on to your kids, such that at the end of it, right, whether they receive an inheritance or whether they receive a legacy from you, or you give them some kind of leg up because of your financial resources, that's the least valuable thing that you're giving them. It's really the lessons and the wisdom that you've accumulated, and probably you accumulated from your parents and they accumulated from their parents. And so when you think about the billions of people that came before us, and you're right there on the tip of the pyramid, there can be a little bit of pressure there, but also like you can also be rest easy that at least up until this point, the DNA has carried you to this point, and the accumulated wisdom of your ancestors. Hopefully you can distill some of that and then pass it on to your kids, and then send them off into the world to be successful themselves.
On that note, I'd love to hear like what both of you think about some of the most powerful or single best kind of thing that you learned from your parents. Like, just give an example for our listeners here of what has transcended the decades and still lives with you in a positive way.
I mean, from my dad, 2 lessons come to mind straight away. And one is just the value of $1, and that it's all the work that went into producing that dollar, and not diminishing how much time and energy and effort it took to, and today maybe we'd say $10 or $100, but there's money isn't just there to be spent. It can be invested, it can be saved, and then you can grow that. So, you made maybe 8 hours of effort to produce $100 worth of value, but now you can invest that $100 worth of value, and in 5-10 years, it's doubled, but you didn't do any more additional work, right? So having that idea that money isn't just something that you can trade immediately for a good. And I guess maybe that part of that too is delay of gratification, which is something that I have had to unlearn a little bit as my income and my net worth has gone up, because while that was a very good lesson when I was younger and didn't make as much money, now it's flipped and it's like, oh wait, hang on. If I continue to save at a 80 or 90% savings rate, I'll be the richest man in the graveyard, but how many memories may I have missed out on because I didn't fly to Hawaii to see Jamie, or I didn't do other things with my family because I was hyper-focused on maintaining a high savings rate.
I think mine was a little less positive maybe, but the lessons I took away are still powerful. I think I remember a lot of stress and a lot of fighting about money. One parent that was very frugal and cheap, and the other one that could care less about any kind of restriction. But on the flip side of that, especially with my mom, she was very much into paying for quality things, like quality shoes will cost more money, but it's worth buying for quality things. And that sometimes created another conflict or source of tension in the house. Each of us probably has some positive and some negative, but I definitely took away a lesson that I did not want money to be stressful or a source of friction in my house as I got older.
Really interesting to hear. Now you think about like implying or imparting those next level generation decisions down. It's like, how do we learn from the mistakes of our parents? Like, I would echo kind of what you said, Spencer, there, like the value of hard work. I'm so thankful to my parents, especially my dad, about that. At the same time, the flip side for me is I sit on this side of entrepreneurship and business ownership, which is I'm having to learn the lesson anew as an adult that actually, in many cases, in my case, as a business owner, right, the value of my time is not spent in what I do, but in the impact that I bring as the business leader, as the ownership with the vision. So in other words, an hour of my time is not worth what someone will pay for it, but the hour of my time is like the opportunity cost. What else could I be doing with it? So one of the things I'm thinking about now is how do I teach my kids that the value of hard work while at the same time recognizing to look for those entrepreneurship opportunities that I feel like I was not taught growing up. And that's all tied up in money too, because like, especially those of us in the military, one of the things that was a big radical shift for me as I got out was I'm not making the fixed income anymore. The amount that I work and how I put my efforts into this scale with income. So it was another radical shift there. And so what I'm getting at with this is we learn different stages of money, and we're teaching those, whether we're intending or not, to our kids at early stage, middle stage, and we'll start to talk about here as they prep for college and life on their own, is the same things that we have learned in our own life, right? Some lessons served us well in different stages of life that don't later on. So the money lessons that you're teaching kids should evolve as well. How to do that? Good luck. Just recognize that what you taught them is not always the same thing that you should continue to, right? Let the lessons evolve as the kids grow up.
On the hard work thing, Daniel, that rings true with me as well. Where as an entrepreneur, it's no longer what someone will pay me for my hour of my time, right? It's what can I spend an hour of my time doing that I can then go hire people to do things for me that will produce even more economic value, right? But it's almost like you have to go through the steps. And I think this is why like working minimum wage, fast food, stocking shelves, like manual labor, like lawn care and stuff, like working those jobs when you're younger, when you're teens or 20s, I think is so valuable because it teaches you that hard work is the prerequisite. Like it's the bare minimum you need for entry. But then you have to realize that no matter how hard you work, if you're trading your time for money, then you're always going to be trading your time for money. If you do, and I tell my dad this all the time because he's a business owner as well, and he does his own bookkeeping. He does his own, like he cashes his own checks. He drives to the post office, right, to buy the stamps, to mail the checks. And I say, Dad, if you do $30 an hour jobs, then you're going to be doing $30 an hour jobs for the rest of your life, right? Like have the resources, and you're doing the world a disservice by not hiring someone to do that. Because if you hire someone at $30 an hour, that's still a pretty good wage in the United States. I mean, that's $60,000 a year. That's the median income. And that's a job for someone that didn't previously have a job. So hire someone, let them do it for you. And now you can focus your time and attention where you actually add value, which is not mailing checks, which is not driving to the post office. Just a quick note from one of our sponsors, and then we'll be right back to the show.
Hey, Spencer, I got a cousin that just graduated from high school and they're about to start basic training in a few months. Any ideas on a gift I should get him?
Yep, sure do, Jamie. The Military Money Manual, A Practical Guide to Financial Freedom, is a concise, easy to read, and practical guide to your military money. It's the book that I wish someone had handed me on my first day in the military. In the book, I explain the exact money tactics and investing strategies that can enable you to achieve financial independence while serving in the U.S. military. It's available on Amazon, Audible, and my website. It's hardcover, paperback, ebook, Kindle, and audiobook. You can get a special discount using promo code podcast on my website, shop.militarymoneymanual.com.
So Daniel, I want to ask about a couple practical tips that I think that someone dialing in might also have asked about. I said dialing in as if we're a radio show or something, but they may have also been curious about. And a lot of times when people find out that they're expecting or their spouse is expecting, they might immediately get bombarded with 529s and Gerber Life Insurance and all these products, UTMA and all these acronyms. Where do people even start with preparing for their little one for future life, like whether it's college savings or whatever in the future?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I like to run through with my clients. So setting your kids up for success. We've talked a lot about the education. Let's talk a little bit about the tactics, especially as it relates to getting them set up for college. So you're expecting a kid, right? All right, so they come out, you're going to get a social security number. That's going to allow you to do kind of the next step things, which is opening up some accounts. Now, the caveat to what I'm about to say here is that when you start contributing money towards kid-specific goals, i.e., a UTMA brokerage account, a 529 college savings plan, things like this, I'm making the assumption here that your own financial plan is mostly on track, right? In other words, you're not borrowing from Peter to pay Paul here. You're not sacrificing your own future and present needs to be able to accomplish that. Okay, having said that, so you might want to consider, once the kid is born, opening up a UTMA account for them. So that's where you, as a brokerage custodian, so you could go to Charles Schwab, Fidelity, things like that, open up this account. This is going to be a taxable brokerage account where you as the parent can be the custodians. That means you're the one controlling it, managing it, but the child is the ultimate beneficiary. The caveat here is this is an irrevocable gift. Once you put the money into the account, that money is theirs. For most states, these are state-specific type accounts. The kid can receive the funds on their own at an age of majority, which is typically 18 or 21. Most of my clients use 21 when we set these up. In a few cases, you can go longer than that. But what that means is that this is not restricted like an education account. So this could be used to buy a first car, a house down payment, maybe a wedding, something else that comes along like that. And you can invest it in anything that you would in a typical brokerage account. Typically, I advocate, low cost, broadly diversified index funds. Now, one of the beauties of doing this is you get to have some extra tax advantage of the code. Okay. Part of the tax code of a UTMA allows for tax advantage of these investments. Okay. So the first $1,300 in 2024 of dividend or capital gain income that was paid out in a kid's UTMA brokerage account is tax-free. And then the next $1,300 was taxed at only 10%. So really you got $2,600, which you can do a lot with. Okay. Particularly if the parent, you're otherwise going to hold those assets in your own brokerage account. This is a way to potentially make it a little bit more tax advantage. Now, you may contribute with these accounts with cash, i.e. fund it with a check or a bank transfer. Or if you really want to be financially savvy, maybe you look at assets that you already have. So this could be cost basis of, maybe you want to fund it with assets that you are, as the parent, already own in a brokerage account. So this could be something that you bought years ago, say a low-cost index fund like VTI, and maybe the cost basis is 50, okay? But that share has gone up a lot, and now it's worth, say, 150 in our example. So your cost basis is 50, value is worth 150. So if you sold it today, that'd be $100 worth of, in our case, long-term capital gain. Now, if you instead gift that share to your child in their UTMA account, the cost basis of $50 goes with them. It's now the kid. Now the kid can sell it in the account, or you sell it on their behalf in the account, generate that capital gain, and back to that threshold we just talked about, pay no tax or very little tax on it. So this may be a way to carefully, strategically shift some assets out of your taxable column into theirs and advantage them. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You might also want to consider setting up a 529. Now, there's a variety of ways you could do this. We're going to talk about integration with GI Bill in Chapter 35 in just a minute. But the restriction here is a 529 account, unlike a brokerage UTMA, it's going to be more restrictive. Typically, it's for qualified higher education expenses. Now, there's a few places you can use up to $10,000 a year out of a 529 plan for private K through 12, but most of my clients are typically using these to compound save for higher education. Now, I love 529s even more after the Secure Act 2.0 passed, because I used to hear the excuse about, well, what happens if they get over-contributed? Well, now there's an opportunity, caveats apply, at least 15 years open, et cetera, et cetera. Not all states allow them, where you can transfer some of those funds up to $35,000 right now out of the 529 into a Roth IRA in the kid's name. So there's a way around that. But just understand when you're putting money to 529, it is also much more flexible. So unlike a UTMA that is irrevocable in the name of that child, 529 is much more flexible. Hey, Johnny got a full ride scholarship to West Point. Great. Let's give it to Susie. She's going to NYU instead, right? You can use that interchangeably within a family, much, much easier. So those are two places that I'd start with looking at investments to start. We haven't yet touched on it, but it's this idea that I see more often than not in the TikTok parts of the world of personal finance advice. So, buyer beware. But it's this idea of using permanent life insurance often as a college funding strategy, or just retirement funding strategy, but used specifically in the pitching of the college. Because they'll talk about things like, oh, it doesn't go on the FAFSA. Well, okay, there's a lot of things that go into FAFSA. And in fact, it just recently changed. Again, that's the free application for federal student aid. And even if stuff goes onto the FAFSA, most military families are not facing some of the income phase outs that a family making $400,000 or more of income are going to face. So take that with a grain of salt. Just because it goes on the FAFSA does not mean it's a big deal. Even 529s are only calculated just under 6%. In other words, the entire balance of the 529, only 6% of it is calculated every year into the expected family contribution. But anyway, so a lot of these people are using permanent life insurance as a way to, save for it and it will grow at this level of rate. Yes, it might grow a little bit, but remember, you have a cost of insurance because it's primarily about that. Why do we buy life insurance in the first place? It's to replace income or for specific family planning needs, i.e. closely held family businesses, special needs considerations, etc. Unless your kid has some unusual circumstances, i.e. uninsurable later on in life, then most of the time they're not going to need any level of life insurance as a child, much less a permanent policy to carry on into their adulthood. Okay, so these policies are expensive, they're unnecessary. The reason why they get sold, again, is because they pay high commissions to the agents who sell them. It's in their best interest, typically not yours. So if you're wanting to fund college, you're going to be much better off typically using a 529 or a UTMA or those military-specific benefits like GI than using it. Now, if you're really concerned that your kid needs some kind of life insurance, what you can do is obviously use some level of FSGLI, but also if you wanted to go get a term life insurance policy on your own life, many of these allow you to add something called a child rider. Okay, so typically up to about $25,000 per kid that's issued, no medical underwriting for the kid or things like that. And in the event that they ever have some type of lifetime health consideration that wouldn't allow them to get life insurance, typically you can convert a portion of that child rider or all of it into a permanent policy later on for when they're, say, in their early 20s or something like that. So don't get suckered in by the pitches. They're too good to be true. They're not really as good as they say they are to buy permanent life insurance for your kids, certainly as a college funding strategy. Stay away from that.
So you mentioned Chapter 35. That's something I'm not as familiar in, but we have had Kate Horrell talking about GI Bill before. I don't even think she mentioned that. And she's definitely or at least one of the friends I consider a GI Bill expert. What is Chapter 35? And now thanks for adding another thing I have to go research.
So I got this one pulled up. All right. So VA Chapter 35, or DEA, Dependents Educational Assistance, is a special program. Typically, I run across it in my work with Gold Star widows, but it's also available to veterans and their dependents who have been given 100% total and permanent disability rating. Okay, so for a specific subset, not just 100%, but that total and permanent rating there. And so it's an additional education benefit that cannot be double dipped at the same time as GI Bill, but can be used to help pay for a variety of things, but most often full-time coursework at a higher education university, apprenticeships, things like that. So right now, for the current academic year, full-time enrollment, the student would get $1,536 for each full month. That's just a cash payment per month. If you're half-time enrollment, it's $890 per. So that's the way it works. Now, one of the other benefits I've seen working with clients with Chapter 35 is say you've got students, they're living in Florida, full-time residents, that's where the parents retired from the military, and now kid wants to go to school in another state. Typically, the VA Chapter 35, as a condition of receiving it, that university will make that student in-state tuition. So it's a hack to potentially get around out of state, especially if you've got multiple kids and balancing things with like the GI Bill there.
Absolutely. It's another layer of complexity. I was already committed to hiring a coach to help me figure out college planning for 3 kids, 1 GI Bill. Maybe one of them gets a scholarship. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm definitely going to hire out some assistance for that one. I know like pre-funding is out there, prepaid college and things like that. Are there use cases where you see or recommend to some of your clients to do that? Or is that something that is almost in air quotes, almost always avoid prepaying for college?
I've not yet had a client situation where they were super excited about it, nor do I think it was the absolute right goal, primarily because so many military families are still moving around. They don't know exactly where they're going to end up long term, right? Whereas most of these prepaid state tuition plans are, you buy it in Florida, it's good for any Florida university, or state college in that state. And it's less flexible. I mean, you can get your money back, but then your growth is way less than it would have been potentially invested in a regular 529. There's a few other things I just want to mention real quickly. So we didn't talk about credit score, but this is something that it's a little hack, but it does add up over time. So once you have that Social Security number, you can add your minor children as authorized users on one of as the parent's credit card. Now, again, you should only do this if you have really good credit and plan to keep really good credit. But if you do, choose a low or no annual fee credit card that you plan to keep for a very, very, very long time. So don't put them on a card that you're going to close at some point. Keep them on one. And that can start to build a little bit of their credit history. My grandfather put me on one of his credit cards. So actually, I have credit history that goes back older than I have been alive, which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it. Every time I look at my credit report going back to such and such state, I'm like, wow, that's so cool. Yeah. So that's one little thing, right? Another little thing that you could do is also related to protecting your child's identity. This is becoming more and more common as cyber criminals get smarter and look in different ways. So after you've done a lot of these things, like set them up as an authorized user, open various types of investment accounts, things like that, you might consider contacting, and unfortunately, it is a terribly laborious manual process, but contacting the 3 credit agencies individually and having your child's credit completely frozen so that we know accounts could be open in their name. So 2 little things that might add up, but could definitely have an extra layer of protection for them.
We actually talked about freezing credit on the show a couple weeks ago. I'll have to go get it was a cybersecurity 101, episode 157. And we were actually able, so all the credit bureaus now have their own app and their own websites. And so once you create an account on each one, freezing and unfreezing the report was actually, we were able to do it live on the show and only took about 2 or 3 minutes. So
I'm very glad that it's way easier for yourself, but when you're doing it for your minor child, unfortunately, it still is paper and mail process, unless something changed like in the last few weeks. Now, let's go back to this college piece, because this is where it starts to get really complicated, right? So your kid's in high school. Now, hopefully, you've not done what Ron Lieber calls in his other book I recommend, The Price You Pay for College, a really amazing book on understanding how aid formulas work, the way college acceptance actually works behind the scenes, how all these formulas fit together. As he says, the most dangerous words in the English language are just get in and then we'll figure it out. So again, back to the idea that one of my old bosses always told me, which is, happiness is expectations minus reality. So setting appropriate expectations for your kids early enough before they get the too big dream. Okay. Now, military families, thankfully, in many ways, have a lot more financial education resources than the majority of Americans or average American out there today, but that doesn't mean that it's unlimited, or certainly that it's going to make sense for your family's financials. So first thing is having appropriate conversations about what is and is not going to be possible as a piece of that. Because even if you have GI Bill and potentially Chapter 35 and you've got a well-funded 529 and all these things, right, you still want to use it wisely. So borrowing again from another colleague of mine who runs a lot of this college funding, he always called it the college pre-approval process. Okay. So much like you and I have gone to buy homes before, and we go to a lender, and that lender asks us for a host of financial information about our income and our assets, current state, of the house, what's it going to look like, all that kind of thing. And then they say, you are pre-approved for this amount. And you can go and you can bid on a house 10 times that, and they'll laugh at you, right? Because you are not going to get it. You are not pre-approved for that. And yet we do the exact opposite many times when it comes to paying for college, which is say yes first and then find out the price later. And that's horrible. Like, there's a reason why we have the student loan issue in our country. I mean, there's a whole other story behind that, right? All the layers that go into that. But because lots and lots of people went to higher education without a plan, without understanding what the price was, and many cases falling off along the way, right? So setting your kids up for success is going to start with a good college pre-approval. And you can do that. I'll send a Google sheet that you're welcome to share with your listeners here. And it has some pretty good examples in there, like parent resources. So things like 529, GI Bill, Chapter 35. There's also a thing called the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which for families that are below a certain AGI threshold. So typically that's not going to be dual military couples or even, senior officers, but you're going to be able to get potentially up to $2,500 back of the $4,000 that you pay in. So out of cash flow. So that's another reason maybe not to always put everything in 529, as well as what you were paying along the way. Like, a lot of families forget that, hey, when kids in high school, they've got sports and activities and lunch money and all this stuff. And a lot of them can redirect that during the undergraduate years to help fund that. So those would be some examples of like parent resources, parent loans, student resources, what they saved up, what they can work, maybe a part-time job, something like that. Then we've got some level of student loans that might make sense. For a lot of my clients, we'll still take the direct unsubsidized and the direct subsidized federal student loans. So typically somewhere 27 to 50,000 over a course of undergraduate degree. We're typically going to try to avoid private student loans if possible. So anyway, we start to add up all these things, and that gets us to a 4-year pre-approval total. And then we know, okay, we've got $167,000 in our made-up example here to go out. And then we can actually start to compare aid letter from school A against aid letter from school B to see, like, hey, does this start to actually make sense?
That's a really powerful process. I think the intentionality of that and the expectations, like you said, are so important. People would just go out and be like, oh, I want to go to this school because it's in a pretty location, or I like the colors of their uniform. Like, people choose colleges for incredibly silly reasons sometimes, and we don't sit back and think about what are we allowing our kids to do for the rest of their life if we don't do responsibly and set the expectations ahead of time. So I think that pre-approval process is a really powerful conversation to have.
I went into, basically it was either the first or second most expensive school in the country at the time, and didn't have an ROTC scholarship, and just took on some student loan debt and figured it out, picked up an ROTC scholarship the second year, and ended up graduating with $60,000 of student loan debt. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if, as I was paying off that debt, I was like, man, I really wish my parents had been like, oh, this isn't such a smart idea. Maybe you should go to a state school. But the process of actually paying off the student loans probably led to the creation of this whole military money manual brand. If I had taken the smarter route, would I be a little bit wealthier today? Maybe, but maybe not, because maybe I would never have started this business. I love the idea of the pre-approval and like, but it's so hard when, I remember I was like 18 years old and I was like, well, it doesn't really matter how much school costs because I'll be making $100,000 a year, within a couple of years of graduating, and I'll be able to pay it all off. And you don't recognize that, well, you're making $100,000 a year, but okay, first, like, Uncle Sam's going to take 20% of that for taxes, and then you're going to have to pay rent, and then you have to buy groceries, and your cars aren't free. And, oh, you have, a couple $1,000s left over. What do you want to do with that? We try to get these 18-year-old kids to make these decisions, but it's almost like, at least when you're doing like a planning process where you're running like a pre-approval type thing, at least there you're like actually putting some like real numbers on it. But again, like for an 18, 19-year-old kid, like even if they've been good with money their whole life, even if they've been saving money their whole life, the numbers just become so astronomical that they're like, well, I can't pay for this. Just a quick note from one of our sponsors, and then we'll be right back to the show.
It's no secret Spencer and I are both huge fans of the Thrift Saving Plan, the military's version of the 401k retirement plan. We've both been investing in the TSP for over 14 years and are thrilled to announce we've consolidated all the information you need to know into a new course called the Confident TSP Investing Course.
That's right. The course is a comprehensive guide to navigating the TSP, breaking it down to easy, bite-sized chunks that lay out the basics of the thrift savings plan, the funds available, and the investing strategies so you can build wealth while you serve.
We both know what it's like to be a beginner and to be overwhelmed with all the information that's out there about investing in the TSP. Head over to militarymoneymanual.com/TSP, Tango Sierra Papa, to find our simple breakdown of all you need to know. You get lifetime access, and we'll have a growing library of content. And one of my favorite parts about the course is that for every course we sell, we're going to be donating one to an E4 or below.
Yeah, I love that feature of the course, Jamie. So if you're an officer, an NCO, a senior NCO out there, and you purchase a course, first of all, thank you. And also know that you're helping a fellow service member, a sailor, a soldier, a Marine, an airman, a guardian, a Coast Guardsman, E4 or below, take one step closer to their financial success.
The link's in the show notes, or head over to militarymoneymanual.com/TSP, where you can sign up for the Confident TSP Investing course. Now, back to the show. I just think so many of the conversations, maybe go back to what I said earlier about maybe overcompensating and things that they wish that your parents had done for you or for me. My baby has to go to the best school. They have to. And I think in very few career fields does it actually matter where you went to school. And most American families would do better, in my opinion, by not caring about judging someone based on the label on their sweatshirt. It's like, if it's comfortable and it fits your needs, then enjoy the sweatshirt. Don't worry about what your friends are wearing or what brand is cool right now. 16 years of active duty. I went to a very small private school that had almost nothing other than soccer and basketball team and like a really small weight room. And sure, it was near a beach and that's what attracted me, but I don't think anyone's ever asked me about my undergraduate experience or where I went to school. And had it not been for my RTC scholarship, it would have been way more expensive than I could have afforded without setting myself up for long-term financial impact. And also remember, even if you have a high-paying job in the future, plenty of people, like Daniel mentioned a few minutes ago, don't end up finishing that degree. And then they're still stuck with a medical school debt or whatever without the actual degree to pay that off with the income that you're expecting to have.
Debt is sometimes such a big concept, especially around education. And it comes up regularly about people who have very strong opinions one way or the other. And that's fine, right? That's your personal values that should dictate your financial plan. But just be careful about translating those or projecting them onto your children as they get ready to make this big decision. Because especially if a school is the right fit and as a part of this pre-approval process, it does make sense and it ticks all the other boxes for career and network. And again, go read Ron Lieber's book on the price you pay for college. He talks a lot about like, what are the reasons to pay for something versus not? Like networking, yes, that's potentially something that's extremely valuable. Name brand recognition, to your point, Jamie, probably not so much, right? But with that, if you right size undergraduate debt to about the starting average salary for the career field, okay? So if you're going to be a software engineer and your starting job is probably in the 70 to 80K range, right? Then you could take on potentially up to 70, 80K of student loans for undergraduate degree versus if you're going to go be an elementary school teacher and your starting salary is closer to, in a rural part of the country, maybe $40,000. Now you had better take on way less to be able to meet that. So right size the amount of debt if debt has to be taken there as a piece of that. Now, we have not mentioned it up to this point, but there is one other piece that is here. Now, I've not had a client do it. I've had some of my other financial advisor colleagues, friends do this, which is, again, for that veteran that has that 100% disability rating, that has the ability for a one-time dischargement of the student loans in their name. So potentially even not for yourself, but for your child. And so taking on some levels of student debt as a part of an overall education planning process. I don't know if this rule will change in the future, but as of right now, that is an option potentially where you as the parent take on some of that student loan debt and then have it discharged with that one-time piece of your disability. So contact a veteran service organization or something like that to help make sure you get all the T's crossed, I's dotted for that particular process. But debt can be a piece of this if it's used wisely and well.
Good point. I think I want to go back to the philosophy a little bit in this question of what are some things you could talk through a client that maybe is saying, I have the resource to cover this, but I don't want to, or I need to set it aside for other priorities, or, hey, we had already planned to buy a beach house, and so we're not canceling that for college savings. Like, how does a family work through that dynamics of can versus values and priorities?
As a part of that, what you're looking at your overall financial picture, what are the trade-offs? And that's what personal finance really is. You can spend $1 once, you can save it, set aside, and spend it on something else or give it away in the future. And that's what you're looking at here with a college decision, right? If you as a family decide my kid gets into school XYZ, and that is so important to us that we are willingly going to make trade-offs, great. If that works, I have nothing against that. Make it a good decision. Make sure that you're all on the same page, and then recognize that expectations are the piece that leads into that, right? So what are your expectations going into that, and helping your kids set it? Honestly, outside of like overbuying and becoming house rich, cash poor, overpaying or being overextended for college is one of the most common mistakes that I see with parents. So more often than not, I see them reaching way beyond their financial capacity. And then I'm having to deliver bad news like, okay, well, if you want to do this, that means you will work 10 more years. Is that okay with you? Oh, I didn't realize it was going to be that much. I'm like, well, a well-informed decision would have hopefully prepared you for that.
I think one of the biggest takeaways for this is that it's quite complicated to raise kids and to parent them well and to talk to them about money, teach them good money mindsets, have positive conversations about money and the money scripts that we're forming in our children's mind. If we're just feeling overwhelmed, we want more resources, or we're just really into this and we want to learn more, can you share some books or resources with us that have helped you or have helped your clients?
Yeah, so I've mentioned a couple of them along the way, 2 of them by Ron Lieber. And then for those in the Dave Ramsey camp as well, there's another one called Smart Money, Smart Kids by Dave Ramsey and his daughter, Rachel Cruz. Our good friend Doug Nordman and his daughter, Carol Pittner, wrote a great book called Raising Your Money Savvy Family for Next Generation Financial Independence. Love that one. It's really cool because they go back and forth. Like Doug will share, hey, we taught this money lesson, and then Carol will share her perspective as a kid. Like, well, actually, I thought that was kind of dumb and I didn't pay attention to. And here's when I actually learned it. So it's a really fun back and forth in that one. Another one related specifically to college is How to Pay for College, a Complete Financial Plan for Funding Your Child's Education by Ann Garcia. And then there's a variety of small books and things like that are age appropriate for kids as they're growing up through the early middle years and high school and things like that. One that stands out more for younger kids is called 4 Money Bears by Mac Gardner. So those are some ones I would take a look at. I also have a whole list of resources you can put in your show note from things like FDIC, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, National Credit Union Administration, U.S. Mint. They've got games and resources and a whole bunch of stuff. Some of it built for more of like a school setting, but you could certainly use that in a home environment as well.
Yeah, those are some awesome resources there. I've read Ron Lieber. I think he does a column. Is it for the New York Times?
He's a columnist for the New York Times, yes.
Yeah. He's always got some really good insights, and I like a lot of what he writes. And I'm gonna have to go pick that one up. The Opposite of Spoiled. One of the biggest takeaways here is like, if you got through the 54 minutes of this podcast so far, like you've already done more work than most people in America will ever do when it comes to thinking about money and their kids. And so much of what we do is just on autopilot. And if we're lucky enough to have kids or to be around kids or to be a role model for kids or to be a teacher or an instructor of children, you have this fantastic opportunity where you can be kind of that crazy, quote unquote, rich auntie or rich uncle who, just like when you're driving in the car, you're like, impart this money lesson to them. And you might not even realize that you're doing it, right? You might just be answering the 7th of their 25th question of the day, but that might be the moment that sticks with them. And, when they grow up and become a billionaire, they attribute all their success because of that thing that you said to them, and it was just an offhand comment. So it's important to both formalize and take the time to, read books and sit down and talk with your kids and, try to get the messaging exactly right. But also at the same time, it's just live your life. And when your kids see you being generous, right? And when they see you tithing to your church or giving to a charity or supporting family or friends, they pick that up and they'll start to think about, okay, when they're older, they'll say, they might be giving and they might not even ever question why they were giving. They're like, oh, that's just what my mom and dad did. And so that's what I do. And if they actually sit down and think about it, they might think, oh yeah, this is something I want to be doing, but they might never consider it themselves. And at least you're setting them on a good autopilot from a young age.
I like how you said in there, even like the idea of an aunt or an uncle who gets an influence, right? We've talked a lot about this in the context of parenting and your own kids, but I mean, how many of the money lessons, much less life lessons, have we gotten from other people who are maybe in our sphere or close in our orbit, like that other family member? So I'm thinking about like just the ability to maybe, other people in your family who may not have the resources, the ability or something to teach them these lessons, but to come alongside and just be an additional resource, a knowledge point, that person they can go to and trust and teach. Those lessons could sink a lot deeper than you might ever realize.
Daniel, what's the best place for people to find you on the web if they're interested in what you're working on or want to work with you?
You can find more about me on my website, wisestewardshipfp, as in financialplanning.com. I also host a podcast, Military to Financial Planner, for those who are interested in becoming a financial planner themselves.
That's awesome. And I'll also throw out a shout out to the Military Financial Advisors Association, MFAA. They're at militaryfinancialadvisors.org. And you can check them out there. Danielle has been involved with them for a long time as well. If this is the first time you've been hearing Daniel Kopp, go back and listen to our previous episode with him where we talked about money scripts. That was episode 83. And you can listen to our first episode with Daniel, which I really like. It's one of my favorite episodes that we did on the podcast. Cool. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks again.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions presented here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. Reference to any commercial products or services does not constitute DoD endorsement of those products or services.